We are on the very, very first word on DAF Nun Hey Amud Aleph. We were learning yesterday about the great importance of going to great extents to make sure that you preserve the memory of the Torah study that you're learning. So we talked yesterday about using your words, having accuracy of verbiage, accuracy of enunciation, and also the last thing that we studied was using mnemonics, which are simonim, using ways to remind yourself, mnemonic devices, memory devices. All these different devices basically the Gemara is basically trying to tell us that whatever it takes to remember the Gemara, to remember Torah Shabbal Peh, that's what you got to do. And it's on that basis that we learn the next statement, which is Bahaino de Amar Rabbi Avidimi Bar Chama Bardosa Mai Dichsiv Lo Bashamayim Hi V'Lo Me'ever Layam Hi. What does the Torah mean when it says that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he talks to the Jewish people about the Torah, he says it's not in heaven, it's not on the other side of the ocean, meaning that the Torah is accessible to you. But we can infer from that statement that it's not in heaven and it's not on the other side of the ocean. Lo bashamayim hi she'im bashamayim hi at tzarich lalos achareha ve'im me'ever layam hi at tzarich la'avor achareha. That when Moshe told the people it's not in heaven and it's not on the other side of the ocean, what he was implying to them is that if it were in the heavens or on the other side of the ocean, you would have to exert yourself to figure out a way to get there. So that essentially what the Gemara is suggesting to us, that if you find yourself having difficulty remembering things that you're learning, it's a sign that you're not exerting yourself enough, and you just got to go that extra mile to make sure that you retain the information. That's what's being implied by this pasuk. Okay, at least I believe that's the way that Rashi is learning. Okay, that you have to do whatever it takes. Now, Rava Amar Lo Bashamayim Hi Lo Timsa B'Misha Magbiya Daito Aleha Kashamayim V'Lo Timsa B'Misha Marchiv Daito Aleha Kayam. Rava explains, and while there may be some people told me that this was a continuation, I believe that Rava is making a completely separate statement here. Rava is just giving us a different interpretation of the pasuk, and he's saying that the pasuk is reflecting upon the character or the ideology of the individual. That in order to acquire Torah properly, you can't make your mind that is like up in the heavens, which means to have some sense of self-importance and of great stature, because otherwise if you have that attitude you won't be able to retain Torah. And if a person expands his knowledge, which I'm interpreting to mean that he keeps such an open mind that his brains fall out. You know, that's what they say, if your mind's too open, your brains will fall out. He keeps such an open mind to all different kinds of attitudes and all different kinds of systems of belief that he's not going to be able to study Torah. And that's the difference between Bashamayim, up in the heavens, where don't put yourself up so high, and don't make yourself so broad. You've got to be able to stay focused on what our Mesorah is, on what our tradition is, and you've also got to be humble about it too. And Rabbi Yochanan Amar, in a similar vein, Lo Bashamayim hi lo timsa b'gasei ruach v'lo me'ever layam hi lo timsa lo b'sachranim v'lo b'tagarim. Rabbi Yochanan says that it's not in heaven. It means that you will not find the Torah among arrogant people, and v'lo me'ever layam hi, it's not on the other side of the ocean, which means lo timsa b'sachranim v'lo b'tagarim. We had seen this language before, that Rashi had said that the only way to acquire Torah properly is if you're not running around all over the place to do business, to peddle business. You have to confine yourself and sequester yourself periodically in order to acquire the Torah. And if you're always going to be jumping me'ever liyam, you're always going to be traveling and going hither and yon to do different kinds of projects, then you're never going to acquire Torah properly. Tana Rabbanan, Keitzad ma'abrines ha'arim. Now we go back to our halachic discussions. We talked about squaring off a city. So the question is, how do we square off a city in order to determine its boundaries? Arucha kemo shehi. So if it's arucha, as we'll see momentarily, means that if it already has a quadrilateral shape, then you leave it as it is. Okay? Agula, if it's round, osin la zavuyos. You make corners for it, which means you create a quadrilateral around the circle. You bound the circle in a square. or in a rectangle. Yeah. And merubas ein osin lazavuyos. If it's square, then you do not square it off. You do not make corners for it, which seems to be a nonsensical statement. So we'll have to analyze all of these things. And ha'isa rechava mitzad echad u'kitzara mitzad acher ro'en osa ki'ilu hi shaveh. If, let's say, a city is shaped in such a way, where let's say in the northern part of the city it's quite wide from east to west, and then it tapers inward so that by the time you get to the south it's much narrower going east and west than it is in the north. So then by squaring it off is that you draw your on your map, you draw down the lines just going due south from the north to square it off. Yeah, you have all the pictures here. Yeah, you have all the pictures here. Just that different Gemaras have different pictures. Okay. Haya bayis echad yotze kimin pagum, o shnei batim yotzin kimin shnei pagumin, ro'in osan ki iluchut matuach alehem, umoded min menu ulahalan alpayim ama. The next thing that the Brisa says is that if you have houses that are protruding out of the city, either because they're connected to the wall of the city, or they may even be disconnected, but they're sort of just out there on the outskirts of the city. So, and pagum, Rashi had said, is kamin pagum, meaning like there's like a bump protruding out of the wall or protruding inward of the wall. So and if you have either one house that's like that or two houses that are like that, you just draw your imaginary dotted line at the edge of where that house is, and that becomes your squared off area on that side. Haisa asuya kimin keshes o kimin gem. So now we're going to see, this is the more complicated case. If the city is in the shape of a rainbow, or just a bow, but we'll use the rainbow as the example, okay? Or it's in the shape of a gem, which would be, the way according to Rashi learns, is like a chaf sofit, or the letter L, is the way I would describe it. So basically, your city is not, it's concave, is basically what we're saying. There's a concave portion of the city where there are no inhabitants, but there's a surrounding area of habitation all around that uninhabited area. So then what are you supposed to do? Ro'in osa ki ilu himalaya batim v'chatzeros u'modid mimenu lahalan alpayim ama. Then you imagine that concave area that's uninhabited is filled with houses. You square it off, and then you measure 2,000 amas from there. Okay, now let's go back and analyze this brisa. Amar mar arucha kemo shehi. If it's already in a quadrilateral form, so then you just leave it alone. So the Gemara says, Pshita is not obvious. Lo tzricha da aricha uketina. The answer is that it's not in the shape of a perfect square, but it's in the shape of a rectangle. So that it's longer than it is wide, or you know. So mahu detema litin la pusya keurcha kamash malan. That you might have thought that when we say to square it off, then you should draw an imaginary line that creates a perfect square so that it's equidistant on all sides. No, to that extent we're not so makel. As long as you can get it into some rectangular form, that's what you're supposed to do. Merubas ein osin lazavuyos pshita. If it's already square, then you don't make additional corners for it. So that isn't that obvious? No, the Gemara says lo tzricha de meraba avalo meraba biribua olam. The answer is that it is square already, but it's not square along the axes of the earth, meaning that it's like a diamond. It's like a diamond. So therefore, it's not a flat square where the bottom of the square is facing due south, or the top of the square is facing due north, but it's tilted like a baseball diamond exactly. So therefore, mahu detema. You might have thought, lirba of ribua olam, you might have thought that you have a right to square it off so that you create a dotted line that is consistent with the directions of north, east, south, and west on a map. Kamash malan. So therefore, the Bryce is telling us that we don't do that. As long as it's square and it has its corners, then you're already covered. Hayabayis echad yotze kimin pagum o shnei batim yotzin kimin shnei pagumim. So now we go on to the next case of the Brisa, that if you have one protruding house or two protruding houses, you draw your dotted line at the edge of the house. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Hashta bayis echad amart shnei batim mibaya I don't understand. If you can create that extension with just one protruding house, let's say in the north of the city, then surely if you have two protruding houses, that's even more of a justification. So why was it necessary for the Brisa to specify? Once you've told me one, then I surely know two. Lo tzricha mishtei ruchos. The answer is that the protruding houses are on two different sides of the city. You might have one protruding house in the north and another protruding house in the south, and therefore the chiddush is mahu detema meruch echas amrina mishtei ruchos lo amrinan kamash malon. You might have thought that we only allow for the extension based on this protrusion on one side of the city. But let's say you have two sides, especially if they're opposite sides, maybe you don't, and therefore the chiddush is that we do. Next, taisa asuya kimin keshes o kimin gem. If it's shaped like a rainbow or the letter L, so then Rowan Osa ki ilu himalaya batim mechaseros umodim imenu ulahalan alpayim ama. So then we imagine that concave space of the city which is uninhabited as being filled with homes, and therefore we square it off that way, and we measure 2,000 amas in all directions. So Amar Rav Huna, Ir ha'asuya ki keshes, im yesh bein shnei rosheha pachos me'arbas alafim ama modid in law min hayeser. The imlav modid in law min hakeshes. So Rav Huna states as follows. Rav Huna states that the only time that we view the center part of the rainbow that's unoccupied as if it's filled up is only if at the two bottom parts, the two bottom ends of the rainbow are proximal to each other within 4,000 amas. But just imagine a rainbow, a very, very wide rainbow, right? A very wide rainbow, where the distance between here and here is more than 4,000 amas, so then we do not allow for these two ends to be considered to be connected, because since each one's edge of its place of habitation is 2,000 amas, and those 2,000 amma boundaries do not overlap, we cannot consider these two parts of the city to be connected in that way. But rather, we can only connect them through the top part of the rainbow, and therefore we don't imagine this to be a filled-in space, but rather we count 2,000 amas from this end, and you can only walk up until there, and 2,000 amas from here, and therefore there will be a middle part of the city in the rainbow where you won't be allowed to traverse because there's just too much space between this end and this end. So the Gemara now says, Umi Amar Rav Huna Hachi. Is this really consistent with Rav Huna? V'Hamar Rav Huna had said, Choma Sa'ir Shenifritza B'meya Ve'arboim Ve'echas Ushlish, that he had said as follows, that this case is considerably different, but the numbers are different also. Rav Huna was here talking about a case where you have one city with a wall around it, and a bulldozer comes in and just plows through the center of the city, creating this huge breach, so that what was originally one walled city is now two sections with this completely demolished section right down the middle. So Rav Huna says we still consider the city to be one city with the following proviso, that there's less than 141 1/3 amas between the two edges. Okay? If you have more than that, however, it's considered to be two cities. The Gemara's question is, you see that the measurement that Rabbi uses over here is considerably different from the measurement, or Rav Huna rather, is considerably different from the measurement that he's using for the rainbow-shaped city. For the rainbow city, is there a place called Rainbow City? Maybe it's in the comic books. For Rainbow City, you can go up to 4,000 amas from one end to the other, and here we only allow you 141 1/3 amas. Now, the shear of 141 1/3 is based on the fact that that's the measurement of a karfeif. Now, remember what the term karfeif is. A karfeif is an empty lot that is used for habitation, and we allot that to a city because every city needs a little bit of wiggle room outside the city so that people can park their camels and use it for whatever utility they need upon entering or exiting the city. So what basically Rav Huna is saying in the case of the bulldozer, right, is that you can give a little leeway to each city to have that karfeif space. And why is it 70 by 70, and it's actually 70 and a half by 70 and a half approximately, is because we use the size of the courtyard of the Mishkan, which is 50 amos by 100 amos, if you remember that. And when you square that off, it's basically the square root of 1,500, which was approximately 70, a little bit more, 70 and a fraction by 70 and a fraction. Okay, so that's the shear of a karfeif. And so basically, why is the measurement different? Why over there does Rav Huna only allow you 70 and a shtickle for each city, where over here he's allows you much more? You can have as much as 4,000 amos between the two ends of Rainbow City. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rabba bar Ula lo kasher kan beruach echas kan mishtei ruchas. So the answer is that there's a fundamental difference between the two cases. The case of the Rainbow City is where the city is all still contiguous at one point. Benny, we have a Gemara here for you right over here. Someone opened it up for you already. Sure. We always take care of our friends. All right. The answer is that the Rainbow City is all contiguous. It's all connected at one point, and therefore you're allowed to have much more space between one end and the other, because you can still access the entire city by walking across the span of the city. In the case of the bulldozer, the cities are completely disconnected. There's no point of connection between the two halves, and that's why there's a greater limitation in that case. So now the Gemara says, "Umay kamashmal and denosin karfif lazu v'karfif lazu ha'amar Rav Huna chadazimna." So why does Rav Huna have to repeat this case of the bulldozer? He's already taught us already that when you have two cities that are adjacent to each other, you give the karfif space for each city. Ditnan, this is the original machlokas. Ditnan, nostin karfif le'ir diver Reb Meir v'chachamrim lo amru karfif ela ben shtei ayaros. So first of all, we have a machlokas tanoim as to the whole concept of karfif, of the 70 amas, because according to Rabbi Meir, when we start talking about measuring 2,000 amas outside of a city as the city boundaries, that's after you measure the first 70 amas as the karfef space of the city. In other words, according to Reb Meir, every city automatically has this karfef width right outside the city that is still part of the actual city, and then you measure the 2,000 amas from that point. So really, from the walls of the city, according to Reb Meir, it's 2,070 amas. But the Chachamim disagree, and they say no. You measure 2,000 amas from the city walls, and that's it. What are the important aspects of karfef? Of what import are they? Only when you have two cities that are immediately adjacent to each other do we say that we give them a karfef space between each city, simply because each city needs some wiggle room between the cities in order to have for as a utility. That's where we use the measurements of karfef. Do you want to determine whether these twin cities are one city or two cities? You have to see, do they have a karfef distance between them or not? If they do, then they're two separate cities. If not, then they're one city. So, and on that, the itmar, Rav Huna amar karfef lezu v'karfef lezu v'chiya barav amar einos ne'la karfef echad lishneim. And on that we have on the Chachamim Shita of what the karfef distance between the two twin cities is. Rav Huna says it's two karfefs, one karfef per city. And Chia Barav says it's one karfef in total. So we've already seen Rav Huna tell us that when you have two adjacent cities to each other, you give them two karfef spaces, a distance, to determine whether they're two cities or not. Why did Rav Huna have to talk about the bulldozer case, which seems to be exactly the same case? The Gemara answers, I'll tell you why. Tzricha di'ash me'inan hacha mishum dahavalei tzad hayeser me'ikara aval hasam emalo. The answer is, says the Gemara, is because if we only had the discussion over here, which is the case of the twin cities, is because there, the Havale Tzad Hayeser Meikara. Because originally, when the two cities were constructed, they were constructed with that open space between them that the respective members of each city needed. And maybe only over there does Rav Huna say we give them the space of two karfefs, which is the space that they need in order to have civic maintenance. But in a case where one city was bulldozed through, maybe there Rav Huna would be more confining as to what divides two cities and makes them into one, because over there that space was not open space in the past. So obviously you didn't need that as open space, and therefore maybe Rav Huna would say that no, if it's even one karfef distance that would be enough to consider it to be two cities. And conversely, v'iyashmin and hasam mishum dedechika tashmishtaihu, aval hacha delo dechika tashmishtaihu emalo tzricha. And furthermore, did I say that right? Hold on a second.
I think it's
I'm saying the opposite.
Was never divided.
Iyashminu b'chol ma'seir shenifritz hasam kama ravuna karfet l'zu v'l'zu lechamim mishum dahabalu tzad hayeser meikara shayu kavar ir echas.
Yeah.
Right.
When the bulldozer made two carpet spaces, you might have said that it's still okay because they were initially one city.
That they were initially one city, and therefore we could use this carpet space to conjoin them, because they were originally one city. But maybe if there was two cities, maybe Rav Huna would say that two carpets is not enough to conjoin. It's too much space to conjoin the cities. And conversely, if Rav Huna would have only told us the halacha of Vishmin and Hassam, if he would have only told us the case of the two cities, is mishum dedechika tashmitav, because they need that space in order to be able to function as a separate municipality. I just reversed it.
They each have their own parking meters.
Right. But over here, exactly. But over here, where it was really all part of the same municipality, maybe they don't need any space at all. And therefore, having that much space, even less than having that space, would make them into two cities. And therefore, you need both. You need both cases to tell me that in both instances, both where they were constructed as two separate cities, and in the case where it was constructed as one city and just plowed through, the shear to divide them is two karfeks and zehu, and that's consistent in both cases. The kama havi ben yeser lekeshes. So now the Gemara asks another question. The question the Gemara is now asking is, we've talked about the horizontal distance between one base of the rainbow to the other base of the rainbow. Now let's talk about the height of the rainbow, right? How high what's the maximal height of the rainbow to allow you to consider the base of the rainbow to be filled with housing, even though it's currently unoccupied? So the Gemara now says, Rabba bar Rav Huna Amar Alpayim Amma, Rava Bereda Rabba bar Rav Huna Amar Afilu Yeser Me Alpayim Amma. So one Amora says up to 2,000 amas height of the rainbow is what you are required. That's the maximum that you can have in order to consider it to be filled. And Rabba bar, the other Amora, Rava Bereda Rabba bar Rav Huna, says no, even more than that, it's considered to be filled, because Lamaisa, it's really one city. And Amar Abaye Kavasi the Rava Bereda Rabba bar Rav Huna Mistavra the Iboy Hadar Asi Derech Batim. And Abaya just says, I concur with the latter opinion, that it can even be a greater height than 2,000 amas, because Lamaisa, it's all one contiguous city, because you can always traverse the city by walking through contiguous housing, by walking through the rainbow, right? And therefore, we don't really care how high the rainbow is on a map, even if it's very, very high like this. It nevertheless is considered to be, the entire center is considered to be filled with houses. And you square it all off.
The top is squared off too, right?
The top, presumably, because you're making it into a square. Yeah. Next, Hayusham Gedudios Gevahos Asar Tvachim Chule. The next thing that the Mishnah had said is that if you have Gedudios, which are guard posts or huts that are 10 Tvachim high, even if they're ruins, so then as long as they're meant for habitation, that's part of the area that you square off in the city. So my Gedudios, what are these things? Amar of Yehuda, Shalosh Mechitzo Shen Aleim Tikra. As long as it's a structure with 3 walls, even if it has no ceiling, it's still considered to be sufficient for habitation, and therefore it's part of the city. So Ibayalahu, and by the way, it has to be within 70 amas of the city in order to be considered part of the city. Ibayalahu shtei mechitzos ve'shlam tikra mahu. What would be the halacha if you have a structure that's 2 walls with a roof on it? Is not considered to be a habitable structure. So Tashma elu shemis aberin ima. So look at the Brisa. The Brisa says that the following structures are part of the city that you square off. Nefesh sheyesh ba arba amos al arba amos. One is if you have a mausoleum or a crypt. It was typical for there to be a crypt keeper, a guy who would basically live on top of or adjacent to the crypt. As long as it's 4 by 4 amos, then that's considered to be a habitable space. Now, why did you have crypt keepers in the first place? I was just thinking about that this morning. Why would you need a crypt keeper besides having it be creepy?
That's why. There's nothing big deal.
You want to protect the body from being mutilated or stolen. Sometimes you have a person, let's say, might have died. He might have been a very disliked fellow, or maybe he was worshipped, and you wanted to prevent people from desecrating
Are they
the grave.
talking about Jewish graves? Maybe it was a non-Jewish grave, and there always were things that they buried with the person.
Could be.
You might want to
That could also be. By the way, you'll see, it makes no difference whether they're Jewish or not for habitation purposes. You'll see that quite swiftly momentarily. It could be. The Hagesher, or if you have a bridge which has a toll collector who has a sort of like a toll booth by the bridge. The Hakever Sheyesh Bahen Beis Dir, if you have a cemetery which has a, what's the guy who watches over the cemetery? Whatever his name is. He has a domicile on the cemetery grounds. A synagogue that has a sexton's house, that's what it's called. Or a church that has the priest's home, which is usually Catholic churches have that because the priests have to take on not only a life of celibacy, but also of asceticism. They have to divest ownership of everything when you're a Catholic priest. So therefore the church gives them their house. They live on the church grounds. The ha'uravos, stables, horse stables, that have a maintenance man that lives there. The ha'utzaros shabasados, or silos that are in the field that have a guy watching over them that lives there or sleeps there. The Yeshban Beis Dira, and the haburganin shabasocha. Burganin are also these watch huts, watchtowers for fields. The habayas shabayam, or a house that's on an ocean. That's actually on an island. And so if you can sometimes have a coastal city that has small island that's within, right, center island, there you go, that's like within 70 amas of the city, then you could have a house on it that is considered to be part of the city. You have to square that off when you make the city limits. And so those are considered to be part of the square. The elu she'en mis'abrim ima, the following things are not part of the square. Nefesh shenifritzah mishtei ruchoseha, and here's the key phrase, that if you have some kind of structure that has been breached on two sides, so that implies that a two-walled structure is not sufficient.
Even with a roof.
Even with a roof, which is what we're going to suggest in a moment. Elach ve'elach, that if it's on both sides, two opposite sides, you have a breach, it's not considered to be a good structure. The hagesher, or a bridge, ve'hakever, or a cemetery, she'en lahen beis dira, that do not have a maintenance residence. U'beis ha'knesset she'en lahen beis dira lechazan, a synagogue that does not have a sexton's house. U'beis ha'avodas kochavim she'en lahen beis dira lekomim, or a church that does not have a priest's residence. V'ha'uravos v'ha'otros shebasados she'en lahen beis dira, or if you have stables or silos that do not have a security residence by the side of them. U'bor v'shiach u'ma'ara v'goder v'shavach shebasocha, or if you have a well, a cistern, or a cave, or if you have a fence or a dove coop that is bounded by a fence, but there's no place for habitation in that area, v'habaya shebasfina, or if you have a houseboat, because the houseboat is not anchored, is not moored in any one given place, so elu ve'elu, ein elu, mis'abrim ima, that those are not considered to be part of the square of the city. The Gemara says, but what do you see? Ketani mihas nefesh shenifritzah mishtei ruchoseha elach ve'elach, my lavdi katikra. So you see that if you have a structure that is breached on two opposite sides, because therefore it only has two walls, it's not a valid habitable structure. So you see, and the assumption is even if it has a roof, that would answer our question. So the Gemara says, lo, deleka tikra. No, that could be talking about where it doesn't have a roof. So this issue is not resolved if you have two walls and a roof. Is that considered to be a habitable structure or not? The Gemara does not answer this question, but we'll go on to the next discussion. What are you going to use a domicile on a nearby island? What is that usable for? Why do they have it there? So Amar Rav Papa, that sometimes you need to dock or load and unload a ship before it comes to dock. And so sometimes you'd have a guy that would live there, and that would be his job. He would load and unload ships before they came to dock in the bay or the marina or whatever it was.
It was too shallow.
Could have been too shallow, so you needed to remove some of the load. Yeah. All right. So we say that a cave is not part of the city square. So the Gemara now says v'hatani Rabbi Chia ma'ara misaberes ima, but Rabbi Chia has a brisa that says that it is part of it. So how do you reconcile that? Amar Abaya kishiyesh binyan al piha. The answer is that you have a cave, but it has at the mouth of the cave a structure. So that structure acts as the domicile that it makes it part of the city. So the Gemara says v'tepokle mishum binyan gufe. So then why do you have to tell me that it's because of the cave? Then it should be the structure itself should make it a place of habitation. Forget about the cave. The Gemara says, Lo tzricha lahashlam. No. We're talking about a structure that is not 4 by 4 amos, and the cavity of the cave supplements it to make it 4 by 4. That's when Reb Chia's brisa had said that the cave is part of the habitable areas. Amar Rav Huna, Yoshvei tzrifin ein modedin lahen, ela mi pesach batehen. That if you have people who live in huts, now these are itinerant people like Bedouins, is what I would describe them, Jewish Bedouins, or even non-Jewish Bedouins, their huts, even if they create a colony of huts out in the desert, that is not considered to be a city. And therefore, even if there could be hundreds of these tents, each person's tchum is measured from his tent, and you don't make it around the entire colony.
That's because they're on the move.
Because they're always on the move, and therefore there's no permanence to this yishuv, to this settlement. So Masav Reb Chisda, Vayachanu ala yardim mibeis hayeshimos. 1 second, take a look at the Jewish people's encampment in the desert. It says as they got to the border of the Jordan, it says that they camped by the Jordan from Beit HaYeshimot. So what is this place? La'amar Rabba bar Chana l'didi chazili hahu asra v'havitlasa parsi al tlasi parsi. That I saw this place. It was 3 parses by 3 parses, a very large area of real estate, which is where the Jewish people were encamped. And we learned that when they had to relieve themselves, when they had to defecate, they had to go all the way in the back of the camp. They couldn't go in the front or on the sides because the camp would travel, so you didn't want to travel over the place where you had defecated, so you'd have to go behind the camp, but you couldn't just go just away from your tent. You had to leave the entire colony of tents in order to defecate. So you see that the encampment of the Jewish people was considered its own city, even though they were itinerant, they were on the move. So the Gemara says, Amar le Rava digle midbar ka'amart kevin diksivi behu al pi Hashem yachnu al pi Hashem yisau keman dekavia luhudami. The answer is that's different. The Jewish encampment, even though it was itinerant and it was moving, but because God said to settle there, God said stop and rest here, that gives their even temporary encampment a sense of permanence because it was by divine decree. And that's why it has the status of an entire city, and you measure the boundaries of it from the edges of the tents. But when you're dealing with Bedouins who are not being commanded by God to live in a particular place, each tent is its own individual boundary, and you measure 2,000 amos from each individual tent. Amar Rav Chinana bar Rav Kahana Amar Rav Ashi, Im yeshem shalosh chatzeros shel shnei batim hukva'u. He says, what's the minimum size of a city? We learned this before. 3 courtyards, and in each courtyard there's 2 houses. So 6 homes qualifies the city. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Yoshvei Tzrifrin v'holchem midbaros chayin einon chayim u'neshem levaneim einon shalahem. We little got it to finish the day. That Rav says that those who live in huts and those who travel itinerantly in the desert, their life is no life, and their wives and their children are not theirs, which means that there's a lot of bastardy involved in these people's lives. Now, why is that? We'll see in just a second. So, Tanu Nahiyachi, Eliezer Ish Biraya Omer Yoshvei Tzrifin Ki Yoshvei Kvarim. That people who live in huts are like people who live in graves, meaning they're dead because they have to weather the elements. They're constantly worried about weather conditions and things like that. So their quality of life is horrible. And about their daughters, it says, cursed is he who lies with an animal. Their daughters are like animals because of all the bastardy that is involved. So my time. So Ula says the reason is because there's no accessible bathhouse to bathe, and therefore the men and the women are constantly leaving the tent colony to go find a faraway bathhouse, and as a result, it's quite common that the women are left to themselves, and therefore other men will come by and have their way with them. And Rabbi Yochanan Amar b'pnei shemargishin zelo ze b'tevila. And Rabbi Yochanan says the reason is because no, it's more of a concern that when a woman has to go. This is really talking about Jewish travelers, Jewish Bedouins, that when they go to mikvah, many times they'll go with a partner because they don't want to travel by themselves, and they'll be visible to other Bedouins that are out in the desert, and men will find them and they'll have their way with them. So my beinayu, ika beinayu, nahara desamach lebesa. The difference in their answer would be is that let's say you have a small body of water that's usable as a mikvah, but not really usable as a place to bathe, because it doesn't have the quality of water, let's say, or whatever it is, but you can still use it as a mikvah. So according to the second reason, then these people are not considered to be filled with bastardy in their tribe. But according to the first reason, since it's not usable as a bathhouse, the men will still be leaving the colony, and therefore you have to worry about bastardy. Amar Rav Huna, kol ir she'ein ba yerek ein talmid chacham rashai ladur ba. Rav Huna further said that if a city does not have vegetables in it, a talmid chacham cannot live in that city, which is why I'm always an advocate for green, leafy things at the BAYT kiddushes. So the Gemara says, well, memor diyerek ma'alya, is this to suggest that vegetables are good for you? The Hatanya Shlosha Marbinis Hazevel, the Kofiminis Akoma, the Noblin Echad Mechamesh Meos Mimor Einav Shal Adam. There are three things which increase the dung in your body, they cause you to have a stooped posture, and they take away 1/500th of your eyesight. And what are those three things? Ve'eluhein Paskibar B'Shecher Chadash V'Yerek. These are all things that the poor people or people of low income tend to consume. Black bread made of very cheap flour, newly fermented beer, doesn't have a chance to really develop in age, and vegetables. So you see that vegetables are bad for you. Why tell me that they're good for you? So the Gemara says, Lokasha habitume bekarti habishar yarki. One is with garlic and leek, and the other one is other vegetables. Rashi equivocates which one is good and which one is bad. According to one opinion, garlic and leek is bad for you, all other vegetables are good for you. According to the other opinion of Rashi, all other vegetables are bad for you, and garlic and leek is good for you. He's not really sure. Kidatanya, as the Brisa says, Shom Yerek Krishin, Shom Yerek, Krishin Chatzi Yerek, Niratzno Nirasam Chayim. The Brisa says three things. That garlic is a gazunta vegetable. Krishin, cress, is a half a vegetable. And Rashi says that can be either interpreted as good or bad. In other words, if you learn that yerek is a derogatory term, then garlic is a really bad thing. Krishin is only half bad. Or you can learn it as good. Garlic is a real gazunta vegetable. It's a good vegetable. Krishin is a half of a gazunta vegetable. And when you see radishes, you see an elixir of life. So the Gemara says, V'hatanya niratzno nirasamamoves. There's another brisa that says when you see a radish, it means you're looking at poison. Lokasher kan ba'alin kan bi'imahos kan bi'imos achama kan bi'imos hagishamim. Answers the Gemara one of two answers, I think. Either we're talking about two different parts of the radish, which is the leaves of the radish are unhealthy, but the bulb of the radish is healthy. That's one answer. Another answer could be is that it depends what time of year. In the summer months, a radish is refreshing and healthy. And in the winter months, when it's already cold, you don't want to eat a cold radish. That's going to be unhealthy. And we'll hold it here for today.